What happens when a brilliant woman's loyalty becomes the weapon used to destroy her? Elena Brooks was a fearless executive who thought she could outwork betrayal until a ruthless CEO framed her in a scandal that threatened everything. Just as her world unraveled, the one man she'd sworn never to trust again, Graham Whitaker, returned with a choice: hide in shame or fight for the truth. This is a story of redemption, love reborn, and the price of courage. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories. Graham Whitaker had never believed in ghosts, but as he stepped onto the marble floor of the Belrose Foundation Gala, he felt as if the past had risen from the dead to greet him. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, throwing fractured light across the crowd of the city's elite. And for a moment, he was no longer the self-made CEO worth hundreds of millions. He was simply a man returning to a place he once swore he'd never set foot in again. 5 years ago, he had left this city humiliated and broken, his reputation shredded by scandal and debts he couldn't repay. The climb back had cost him nearly everything: friendships, illusions, and no small part of his soul. But as he scanned the ballroom, taking in the glittering gowns and sharp suits, he felt nothing but a bone-deep certainty that this time he was here on his own terms. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored charcoal suit, letting the familiar armor of power and control settle around him. His name had been whispered all week across boardrooms and social columns. Graham Whitaker is back. Some claimed he'd returned for vengeance, others that he was looking to expand his empire. No one suspected the truth, that the driving force behind every calculated move was a woman he hadn't seen since the day she walked away from him, eyes bright with hurt and fury. Elena Brooks. He had rehearsed this moment in his head so many times that he almost believed he would be prepared. Yet, as he spotted her across the room, that thin veneer of composure cracked. She stood beneath a cascading arrangement of white orchids, her slender arms folded across a silk navy dress that hugged her figure with effortless elegance. Her hair, the deep chestnut he remembered tracing with his fingers, was pinned in a sleek twist that revealed the elegant slope of her neck. She was speaking to a man Graham vaguely recognized, one of the directors of Marlowe and Pierce, but her smile never reached her eyes. Even across the crowded ballroom, he saw the fatigue in her expression, the way she held herself taut, as if bracing for impact. God, she was still so beautiful it hurt. The memories slammed into him in a rush. The first time they met, when she'd been a bright, hungry marketing strategist working late in the same co-working space where he struggled to keep his fledgling startup alive. The way she'd believed in him long before anyone else did. The taste of her lips on the night he'd signed his first major contract. And the last time, her voice shaking as she said she couldn't stand by and watch him destroy himself. That final look in her eyes had burned deeper than any failure. A server offered him champagne. He declined. He needed his head clear. He hadn't come here to dredge up old wounds. He told himself that anyway. The invitation to the Belrose Gala had been the perfect excuse to observe her life from a safe distance, to reassure himself she was thriving. He'd pictured her radiant, fulfilled, untouchable, a chapter closed forever. Instead, what he saw was something more complicated. Success edged with strain, grace shadowed by the same restlessness that had once drawn them together. He turned toward the nearest table, scanning the name cards for his assigned seat. But before he could locate it, a voice drifted to the soft hum of conversation, clear and familiar. Graham Whitaker. He pivoted, pulse thudding. Elena stood just behind him, holding a glass of red wine. Up close, he could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the slight hollowness beneath her cheekbones. She looked older and somehow more stunning than he remembered. Time hadn't dulled her impact. It had only made her real. Miss Brooks, he said, managing a polite nod, though his heart pounded so violently he thought she must hear it. You look well. That's a generous lie, she replied, arching an eyebrow. It's been a long quarter and a longer evening. She paused, studying him with that penetrating gaze he'd never been able to escape. I heard you were back in town. I am, he said evenly. On business. Of course. Her smile was brittle, but not unkind. It's always business. Their eyes locked, and for a moment the world contracted to the two of them. Around them guests drifted past, oblivious to the quiet war of memory and unspoken questions crackling between them. "How long are you staying?" she asked after a beat, her tone carefully neutral. "That depends," Graham admitted. "On a lot of things." She looked as if she might press further, but then her companion, a tall man in a steel-gray suit, stepped up beside her, his hand resting lightly on her lower back. The possessive gesture scraped at something raw in Graham's chest. "Graham Whitaker," the man said, offering his hand. "Craig Donovan. We met briefly at the Silverstone conference last year." Graham forced a polite smile, shaking the man's hand. So this was Craig Donovan, Elena's boss, if he remembered correctly, and rumored to be more than that. He'd come prepared to see her with someone else. That didn't make it any easier. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Pleasure to see you again." Elena shifted her weight, her gaze flicking between them. "Craig, could you give us a minute?" she murmured. Her voice held an edge of command that surprised Graham, and apparently surprised Donovan too. He hesitated, his mouth tightening, but eventually inclined his head and melted back into the crowd. As soon as he was gone, Elena's composure slipped. She exhaled, and the small, vulnerable gesture made Graham's chest ache. "I didn't think you'd really come back," she admitted softly. "I wasn't sure I would," he said. "But some opportunities are too important to ignore." "You mean acquisitions," she said, her mouth tightening. "Rumor is you're planning to buy Marlowe and Pierce, or at least take a controlling interest." He studied her carefully. "And if I were, then I'd say you haven't changed at all." Something in her tone stung. He lifted his chin, fighting the old reflex to retreat behind sarcasm. "Maybe I haven't," he said, "or maybe I learned the hard way what it costs to let other people write my story." Her eyes darkened, but she didn't look away. "We all pay, Graham, whether we choose to or not." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The band began playing a low, jazzy number, and the air between them seemed to shimmer with old longing and new wariness. "I won't pretend this isn't awkward," he said finally, "but I'm not here to hurt you." "I appreciate that," she said carefully, "but you should know, whatever you're planning with the company, I won't stand aside." "I wouldn't expect you to," he said, and to his surprise, a flicker of admiration crossed her face. A server approached with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. Elena waved him off, and Graham realized her hand was trembling slightly as she set down her glass. "Graham," she hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor before lifting to meet his again. "I'm glad you're doing well, I really am." "Thank you," he said, his throat tightening, "and I'm glad you're, still you." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Still stubborn, you mean?" "Still brilliant," he corrected, "still impossible to forget." For a heartbeat, he thought she might soften, but then her expression shuddered again, and she took a step back. "I should get back to Craig," she said, her voice measured. "Enjoy the evening." And just like that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the throng of silk and sequins. Graham stood rooted in place, the ghost of her perfume clinging to the air. He told himself he had accomplished what he came here for. To see her, to reassure himself she was alive and whole. But as he watched her slip out of sight, he knew the truth. This wasn't over. Not for him. And if he was honest, he suspected it wasn't over for her either. Graham didn't leave the gala until nearly midnight, long after the last toasts had been raised and the orchestra had packed away their instruments. He sat alone in the back of his town car, staring out the tinted window at the city that had made him and nearly unmade him. The skyline was a jagged silhouette against the velvet night, familiar and alien all at once. When the driver asked if he'd like to be dropped at the hotel, Graham hesitated. He was too wired to sleep, too restless to pretend he hadn't felt something real pass between them. "Take me to the office," he said finally. The driver didn't question him. At this hour, no one did. Whitaker Holdings had secured a temporary suite at the Halberton Building, one of downtown's glass monoliths. It was a statement more than a necessity. Graham wanted every potential rival to see that he was here, firmly planted on their turf, with resources to match. Inside, the suite smelled of fresh paint and ambition. His assistant, Natalie, had left a stack of files on the conference table. Graham flipped through them mechanically, but he was only half focused. Every line of print blurred with memories, The curve of Elena's mouth when she smiled, the tension in her shoulders when she spoke Craig Donovan's name. He could read people as easily as he read contracts, and Elena was worried about something. She hid it well, she always had. But there had been a flicker of unease in her eyes when Craig joined them, a possessive edge in Craig's hand at her back. Graham didn't want to care. He didn't want the old protective instincts rising up like a tide he couldn't control. But there they were, undeniable as gravity. With a sigh, he closed the folder and reached for his phone. He scrolled past a dozen new emails, most of them from investment bankers eager to set up meetings. Instead, he opened the secure messaging app his operations team used. Pull everything you can on Marlowe and Pierce's leadership structure, especially Craig Donovan. I want to know his financials, his connections, and any pending legal issues. He hit send and leaned back, pinching the bridge of his nose. It wasn't personal, he told himself. It was due diligence. If he planned to take a controlling interest in the firm, and after tonight, he was more convinced than ever that he would, he needed to know exactly what he was up against. That included Craig Donovan and any skeletons he kept in his walk-in closet. Hours passed in a blur of research and coffee. By dawn, a dossier thicker than his wrist had materialized on the encrypted drive. Graham read every line. He learned that Craig had a polished resume and an impressive string of successes. But he also had a trail of quiet settlements, employees paid to sign NDAs and vanish. He discovered that Craig's aggressive expansion strategies had over-leveraged the company's cash flow. And he learned that if the right series of loans were called in, Marlowe and Pierce could be forced to sell off major assets to stay afloat. It was an opening, a dangerous one. Graham felt the old rush of adrenaline, the thrill of seeing a path no one else did. But as he studied the reports, one fact stood out above all the rest. Elena's name was on nearly every marketing triumph the company had notched in the last 3 years. Without her, they'd be limping. Possibly worse. She's carrying them, he thought with a pang he didn't want to examine too closely. And if she falls, so do they. The knowledge was both a weapon and a burden. He could use it to force Craig's hand, to pressure the board into selling before the quarterly reports went public. But the collateral damage would land squarely on Elena. And for reasons he didn't fully understand, reasons he didn't dare name, he wasn't ready to do that to her. Not yet. He closed the laptop, exhaustion tugging at him. The sun had risen over the skyline, flooding the suite with watery light. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine an easier version of this story, one where he and Elena had never broken, never turned into adversaries on different sides of the table. He saw them standing together at the edge of this city, daring the world to try and beat them. But that was a fantasy, and Graham had long ago taught himself to bury fantasies before they turned to liabilities. His phone buzzed with an incoming text. Natalie again. Your 9 a.m. with Loxley Capital confirmed. Would you like me to prep a term sheet? Yes, he replied. And set up a meeting with Marlowe and Pierce's CFO. No commitments yet, I just want a conversation. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen. Then, against his better judgment, he added, and send flowers to Elena Brooks's office. No note. If Natalie thought the request was strange, she didn't say so. That was why he trusted her. By the time Graham left the building, the city was fully awake, buzzing with ambition and hunger. He felt a little of that hunger himself as he walked toward the curb. It wasn't just about the acquisition anymore. It wasn't even about proving he'd won. It was about the quiet, unshakable certainty that he and Elena were unfinished business. 2 days later, he found himself seated at the back of a conference room in the Marlowe and Pierce headquarters. The decor was all muted glass and brushed steel, designed to intimidate visitors. Graham wasn't easily intimidated. He watched Elena through the tinted wall of glass as she conferred with her team. She wore a charcoal sheath dress and a look of cool determination. Even here, in the lion's den, she radiated the same restless brilliance that had first drawn him to her. Craig Donovan was nowhere in sight, but Graham knew he was nearby. He'd done more digging since that first night, enough to be sure that Craig had more than a professional interest in Elena's future. And while Graham had no right to care, he found himself caring anyway. When Elena finally emerged, she paused in surprise, her gaze flicking from Graham to the stack of folders on the table. I wasn't expecting you, she said, her voice low. I asked for a meeting. He reminded her gently. No strings, just a conversation. Her mouth curved in a humorless smile. You never do anything without strings. He spread his hands in a gesture of surrender. Then consider this the exception. She regarded him for a long moment, weighing the risks. Then she nodded toward an empty chair. 5 minutes, she said. That's all. Graham sat, every nerve alert. I'll be brief. I'm considering an investment in Marlowe and Pierce, a substantial one. Her expression didn't flicker. You and every other opportunist on the East Coast. Possibly, he allowed. But I'm not here to gut the place. I'm here because I believe it could be more than it is. She arched an eyebrow. And I'm supposed to believe this is philanthropy? No, he said quietly. You're supposed to believe I'm not the villain you've decided I am. Something moved behind her eyes, something he couldn't quite name. You think I've decided that? Haven't you? She looked down at her hands, then back up, her expression raw in a way that made his chest tighten. I don't know what I think anymore. He swallowed. For a second, the years between them seemed to vanish. He could almost believe they were two young dreamers again, building empires out of nothing. Almost. The company is vulnerable, he said finally. You know that as well as I do. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't deny it. If someone less considerate than me takes control, he continued, your position could be at risk. And you think I'd let you swoop in to rescue me? She demanded, her voice rising. You think I'd just hand over everything I've worked for? No, he said. I think you're too proud for that, and that's why I'm here instead of making an offer over your head. She looked at him for a long moment, her breathing unsteady. Then she shook her head. You don't get to play the savior, Graham. Not with me. I'm not trying to, he said softly. I'm trying to give you a choice. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Your 5 minutes are up. He rose too, fighting the impulse to reach for her. Elena. But she was already walking away, her shoulders rigid with fury or fear, he couldn't tell. He let her go. He'd known it wouldn't be easy. She had every reason to doubt his motives. But as he watched her disappear into the labyrinth of glass offices, he felt more certain than ever. This wasn't about business. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about something deeper, a reckoning he'd been running from for 5 years. And whether she wanted it or not, Elena Brooks was part of it. Graham tried to convince himself that Elena's refusal had settled things. She had made it perfectly clear that she wouldn't accept his help, that she didn't trust him any more now than she had the day she'd walked away. But the truth was, he couldn't let it go. Not just because he still wanted her. God knew he did, but because every instinct told him she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't see coming. And if he didn't act soon, it would swallow her whole. 2 days after their tense meeting, he was back in his office, reviewing the numbers he'd ordered his analysts to dig up on Marlowe and Pierce's last 3 quarters. The picture was worse than even he'd suspected. Craig Donovan had overextended their credit lines to fund a series of acquisitions, some of which were already failing to deliver. Revenues were flat, margins tightening. If the wrong creditor called in a loan at the wrong moment, the entire structure could come down. And Elena, brilliant, relentless Elena, would be right at the center of the wreckage. He tried to imagine her expression if she knew he was sitting here, plotting ways to stabilize her company behind her back. She'd be furious. She'd call it condescension or worse, manipulation. Maybe it was. But Graham had learned a long time ago that pride was a luxury reserved for people who could afford to lose. And he'd already lost her once. He wasn't willing to do it again without a fight. Natalie came in carrying a tablet and a mug of coffee so strong it smelled like jet fuel. She set both in front of him and arched an eyebrow. You've been here since before 6, she said, and you haven't eaten. I'm fine, Graham said absently, scrolling through the projections. What did you find out about Donovan's position? She hesitated, and he looked up sharply. Natalie was unflappable in nearly every situation, but now she looked uneasy. His private accounts are cleaner than I expected, she said. But there's a shell corporation in the Caymans, Cedar Row Holdings. It's received 4 wire transfers in the last 12 months, totaling over $8 million. From where? Graham asked. Nominally from consulting contracts, she said. But the entities paying them don't seem to have actual operations. They're all registered through the same offshore trust, which means he's moving money out of the company. Graham's voice was flat. Possibly, she said, or he's laundering bribes. Either way, it's not above board. He closed his eyes for a moment, then set the tablet down. A week ago, he might have seized on the information with ruthless satisfaction. Now, all he felt was a weary certainty that exposing Craig would drag Elena into a scandal she hadn't earned. "Make sure this stays between us," he said finally, "for now." Natalie studied him, her expression unreadable. "You're not going to use it?" "I will," Graham said. "But not yet." She left without arguing, and he exhaled, pressing his hands to his temples. He knew what he had to do next, and he knew it would make things more complicated than ever. But there was no other way. That evening, he attended a benefit dinner at the St. Albans Hotel, an event he would normally have skipped. But Craig Donovan was listed as the keynote speaker, and Graham needed to look the man in the eye. He arrived early enough to watch Craig hold court with a half-dozen local executives. The other man was polished, affable, leaning in with just the right amount of attention as his audience laughed at something he'd said. A performance, Graham thought, and a good one. But underneath the charm, Craig radiated entitlement so thick it was almost a stench. Graham waited until the group began to disperse before stepping forward. "Mr. Donovan," he said evenly. Craig turned, his pleasant smile flickering as he took in Graham's expression. "Whitaker, to what do I owe this surprise?" "I think you know," Graham said. Craig's mouth curved in a smirk. "You're upset because Elena told you no." Graham's jaw tightened. "My conversations with Miss Brooks aren't your concern." "Everything that concerns her concerns me," Craig said, his voice dropping. "I realize you think you have some unfinished fairy tale, but she's not your damsel to rescue, and if you're considering interfering in Marlowe and Pierce's operations, I'd advise you to think carefully." "I don't tolerate sabotage," Graham regarded him coolly. "I'm sure you don't, which is why I'm here to offer you an alternative." Craig's eyebrows lifted. "An alternative?" "You know the company is over-leveraged," Graham said. "You're buying time with smoke and mirrors, but you're running out of both. And you think you're going to sweep in and save us?" Craig sneered. "I think I'm going to make you a proposition," Graham said calmly. "You step down as CEO and sell me a controlling interest in the company. I'll assume the debt. You'll walk away with your reputation intact." Craig laughed outright. "You're delusional." "Am I?" Graham asked quietly. "You've siphoned millions through Cedar Row Holdings. You've lied to your board about your liquidity. You're one quarterly report away from exposure." Craig's face went pale, then flushed red. "You can't prove any of that." "I can," Graham said, "and you know it." For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick with threat. Then Craig leaned in, his breath sour with expensive bourbon. "If you come after me," he hissed, "I'll take her down with me." Graham's pulse spiked. "You don't touch her." Craig's smile was slow and poisonous. "She's already implicated. You think she doesn't know how bad the numbers are? You think she doesn't realize her campaigns were paid for with borrowed money? If this goes public, her career is over." Graham swallowed back the urge to grab him by the throat. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Craig asked softly. "Be very careful, Whitaker. Some of us don't have as much to lose." He turned and walked away without another word. Graham stood there, forcing himself to breathe evenly. He hadn't expected Craig to capitulate easily. But the threat had been worse than he imagined. He had no idea how much Elena knew, or how much Craig could spin to make her look complicit. And that uncertainty was a weapon as dangerous as any evidence. He left the hotel without speaking to anyone, ignoring the curious stares. His driver tried to make conversation, but Graham only stared out the window, replaying Craig's words again and again. "She's already implicated. If this goes public, her career is over." By the time he reached his penthouse, a plan had begun to form in the back of his mind, a way to protect Elena without destroying everything she'd built. But it would require something he hadn't tried in years: trust. And that meant he had to tell her the truth. The next morning he sent a message requesting a meeting. No pretense this time, no carefully worded invitation. Just 3 lines. "I have information you need. It affects you directly. Please meet me." He didn't expect her to agree. So when she walked into his office at noon, her expression wary but resolute, his throat closed around something that felt too much like hope. "This had better be good," she said, refusing to sit. "It is," he said. "I found out how Craig has been funding the company's expansion." Her eyes narrowed. "I don't want your dirt on him." "You're going to hear it anyway," Graham said, "and when you do, you'll wish you'd known sooner." She stared at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then she sank into the chair across from him. "Talk." He told her everything. He laid out the shell corporations, the money laundering, the over-leveraged loans. He didn't spare the details. As he spoke, her face went from disbelief to horror. When he finished, she sat perfectly still, her hands clenched in her lap. "I don't believe you," she whispered finally. But her voice trembled. "You do," he said gently. "You've seen the numbers." Tears welled in her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because he threatened you," Graham said. "He thinks he can use you as leverage." Her gaze snapped to his, blazing. "I don't need your protection." "I know," he said, "but you have it anyway." They sat in silence. He could see her weighing her options, calculating the risks the way she always had. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and hoarse. "If I help you take him down, what happens to the company?" "I'll stabilize it," Graham said. "I'll cover the debts and keep the staff employed, and you'll stay on." She laughed bitterly. "Under your ownership." "Under your leadership," he corrected. "You've earned that." For a long moment she didn't move. Then she rose slowly, her eyes searching his face. "I don't trust you," she said. "I know," he whispered, "but I trust him less." He nodded, something easing in his chest. She turned to leave, then paused with her hand on the door. "Don't mistake this for forgiveness," she said without looking back. "This is survival." Then she was gone, leaving the office somehow emptier than before. Graham leaned back, closing his eyes. He knew it was only the beginning, but for the first time in 5 years, he felt as if they were finally on the same side of something. And God help him, that was all he'd ever really wanted. Graham hadn't slept more than a handful of hours since Elena had walked out of his office with that last cold declaration. She didn't trust him. She might never trust him again. But she was willing, at least, to look at the truth with him. And that was more progress than he'd dared to hope for. The following morning, he met with his legal team in a private conference suite. They'd pulled every document they could find to corroborate the flow of money through Cedar Row Holdings, mapping out a paper trail so damning it made even his most unflappable attorney whistle low under his breath. "If this goes public," his chief counsel said, sliding a thick folder across the table, "Craig Donovan is done. The board will have no choice but to terminate him." Graham flipped the folder open. Page after page of wire transfers, falsified invoices, offshore trusts. He let out a slow breath. "And Elena?" The attorney shifted uncomfortably. "Some of the approvals have her digital signature." "She wouldn't have known," Graham said, sharper than he intended. "I'm not suggesting she did," the man said quickly. "But in a scandal like this, no one cares what you knew. Only what they can prove you signed." Graham closed the folder with more force than necessary. His pulse throbbed at his temples. He'd suspected this was how it would unfold. Craig was too smart to keep all the liability on his own shoulders. He'd scattered it among everyone around him, ready to point fingers in every direction if he went down. And Elena, loyal and tireless, had been the perfect cover, someone whose credibility lent legitimacy to every questionable transaction. "Prepare a summary for her," Graham said at last. "Clear, bullet-pointed, no legal jargon. She needs to understand exactly what she's facing." The attorney hesitated. "Are you sure that's wise? You're not her counsel." "I'm sure," Graham said flatly. The meeting broke up, and Graham stayed behind, staring out the window at the city below. The streets were bright with late spring sun, full of people who had no idea their fortunes could turn on the decisions of men like Craig Donovan. He thought of Elena's face when she'd realized the scope of the fraud, the shock, the sick disbelief, and a surge of fury tightened his chest. She deserved better than this. Better than Craig. Better than him, maybe. But Graham had learned the hard way that life rarely handed out what people deserved. You had to take it, even if your hands got bloody in the process. Late that afternoon, he received a message from Natalie. "She's here." He didn't ask who. He knew. A moment later, Elena stepped into his office. She looked as if she hadn't slept either. There were faint smudges beneath her eyes, and her hair was pulled back in a simple knot, as if she hadn't bothered with her usual polish. But her gaze was clear and steady as it met his. "I read the summary," she said without preamble. And you were right." Her voice was low, exhausted. "Craig's been laundering money for years. He used me as a shield." Graham inclined his head. "I'm sorry." "I don't want your pity," she snapped, but her voice cracked on the last word. "It isn't pity," he said, softer. "It's regret." She looked away. "It doesn't matter. What matters is how we stop him before this all explodes." He felt something uncurl in his chest, a fragile, dangerous hope. She said, "I have a plan," he said. "Of course you do." He almost smiled. Almost. He gestured to the seat across from his desk. When she didn't move, he stayed standing too. They faced each other over the expanse of polished wood, like combatants about to negotiate a ceasefire neither quite trusted. "If we expose him publicly," Graham began, "he'll retaliate. You'll be painted as complicit. Even if you're exonerated later, the damage to your reputation will be permanent." "I know," she said. "That's not acceptable to me." Her chin lifted. "It may have to be." "No." His voice was rougher than he intended. "There's another way." He explained it quickly. A coordinated approach. Graham's team would quietly acquire the debt Craig was using to prop up the company's cash flow. Once Graham controlled the loans, he could call them in, forcing Craig to negotiate or face default. If Craig capitulated, he'd resign in exchange for a private settlement. The board would sign off on Graham's takeover, and the evidence of his embezzlement would remain sealed, unless he tried to retaliate. "And if he doesn't capitulate?" Elena asked. "Then we go public," Graham said. "But at least we'll have given him an incentive to walk away quietly." Her eyes searched his face. "And what happens to me?" "You'll stay on as CMO," he said without hesitation. "Your record stays clean. No one ever sees the documents with your signature." She laughed then, a sound brittle with disbelief. "You'd really do all that just to protect me?" His jaw flexed. "Yes." "Why?" she whispered. "Because I still love you." The words rose up like a wave, threatening to drown him, but he couldn't say them. "Not yet." "Because it's the right thing," he said finally. She shook her head, her expression aching. "You haven't changed." "Neither have you," he said, and for a moment they were just two people staring at each other across a gulf that felt both endless and infinitesimally small. She broke the gaze first, scrubbing a hand over her face. "If we do this, if I stand with you, you have to promise me something." "Anything," he said, "that you won't use this as leverage to control me later." He met her eyes steadily. "I swear." Silence pulsed between them. Then, slowly, she extended her hand across the desk. He closed his own around it, feeling the fine tremor in her grip. "Then let's end this," she said. When she left, Graham stood alone for a long time, her warmth lingering in his palm. He knew this was just the beginning. Craig wouldn't go down without a fight. And neither of them would emerge from this untouched. But at least now, they were facing it together. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of maneuvers. Graham's investment team worked around the clock, quietly buying out the distressed loans from 3 separate banks. He signed the final agreements in a conference room at 2 in the morning, his signature looping across the page with practiced finality. When the last document was scanned and filed, Natalie handed him a slim folder, Craig's entire financial history compiled into a neat, damning record. Graham didn't open it. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what it contained and exactly what it could do. By dawn, every piece was in place. All that remained was the confrontation itself. He met Elena at a small cafe a few blocks from Marlowe and Pierce headquarters. She was already seated when he arrived, a cup of untouched coffee cooling in front of her. She didn't look up as he sat down. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. "No," she said, and finally lifted her gaze to his. "But we're doing it anyway." He nodded. Together they walked the short distance to the office. The morning was deceptively bright, the sidewalks crowded with people who had no idea their world was about to tilt. As they stepped into the lobby, Elena's hand brushed his. It was the briefest touch, so quick he almost wondered if he'd imagined it, but it steadied something in him he hadn't realized was shaking. The elevator ride to the executive floor was silent. When the doors slid open, Craig was already waiting, flanked by 2 members of the board. His smile was as cold as the air conditioning blowing through the corridor. "Whitaker," Craig drawled. "I'd say this is a surprise, but it isn't." "I know," Graham said calmly. "That's why I'm here." He handed Craig the envelope, proof of the debt Graham now controlled. Proof that he could end Craig's tenure with a single call. Craig's face blanched as he scanned the papers. "You bastard." "Call it whatever you like," Graham said evenly. "You're finished. The only question is how you want this to end." Craig's gaze flicked to Elena, venomous. "You think standing with him makes you clean? You were part of this. Your name's on half the documents." Elena didn't flinch. "I know what I signed," she said steadily, "and I know what you hid." For a heartbeat, Graham thought Craig might lunge at her. But then something broke in the other man's eyes, a flicker of fear. "What do you want?" Craig whispered. "Your resignation," Graham said. "Today, in exchange, the records stay sealed. Try to fight me and they go public." Silence stretched. Then, with a shaking hand, Craig set the folder down. "You're making a mistake," he said. "No," Elena said quietly. "You did." Craig looked at her one last time, something bitter and hollow in his expression, then turned and walked away. When he was gone, Elena let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in her chest for years. "It's over," she said, her voice breaking. Graham shook his head. "Not over," he murmured, "but it's a start." For the first time since he'd come back to the city, he believed it. Elena didn't go home the night Craig Donovan resigned. She stayed in the office long after the board had filed out and Craig had disappeared down the elevator, leaving behind only the echo of his threats and the faint scent of his expensive cologne. She sat alone at the long conference table, staring at the contract she'd signed, her signature in careful black ink, anchoring years of ambition to a man she'd never fully trusted. She didn't hear Graham come in until he set a bottle of water beside her elbow. "You've been here for hours," he said gently. "I know." Her voice was hoarse. "I couldn't leave." He pulled out the chair beside hers and sat down, studying her face. In the sterile light, she looked almost translucent with fatigue, but her eyes were clear, and for once she didn't look like she was about to bolt if he got too close. "You did it," he said. "You stood up to him." She let out a brittle laugh. "And now what? You think it's over?" "No." He didn't bother sugarcoating it. "It's not over, but it's a hell of a start." She swallowed, her gaze dropping to her hands. They were still trembling. She pressed them flat against the table, as if trying to anchor herself. "I thought if I worked hard enough, if I built something important, it would protect me," she whispered. "That no one could ever take it away." He wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that she'd been set up to fail by a man who was supposed to be her ally. But he knew Elena, knew that pity would only make her feel smaller. "Building something important is exactly what made you a target," he said instead. "Because you were the only person here Craig was afraid of." Her eyes lifted to his, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of the woman he remembered, the one who'd stood beside him when everyone else had called him a fool. "Why did you come back, Graham?" she asked, her voice soft. "Really?" He took a long breath. The truth had been on the tip of his tongue a dozen times in the past weeks, but he'd always pulled it back. He couldn't this time. Not when everything they'd just survived had stripped away every excuse he'd used to protect himself. "I came back because I couldn't stop thinking about you," he said quietly. "Because I built everything I thought I wanted and it still felt hollow. Because I needed to know if there was anything left between us worth salvaging." Her lips parted, but no words came out. "And yes," he went on, voice rough, "I came back because I knew Craig would destroy you to save himself. I wasn't going to stand by and watch that happen." For a long moment, the only sound was the low hum of the building's after-hours systems. Then she reached out and closed her hand over his. "I don't know if I can ever trust you," she said. "I know," he whispered. "But I'm here anyway." Her fingers tightened around his. Hours later, as dawn crept into the city, they finally left the building together. Graham hailed a car and watched Elena climb inside, her shoulders straighter than he'd seen them in weeks. She didn't invite him to come with her. He didn't expect her to. But before the door closed, she looked back at him and said one word that stayed with him long after the taillights disappeared into the morning traffic. "Tomorrow." He repeated it to himself as he walked the few blocks back to his own building. each step feeling more certain than the last. The following day, the press began to circle. Someone inside the board had leaked the news of Craig's departure, and while the official statement claimed he was stepping down for personal reasons, speculation ran rampant. By mid-morning, 3 reporters had called Graham's office, and half a dozen had cornered Elena as she arrived. Graham watched the footage of her on the evening news. Her chin lifted, her eyes steady as she declined to comment. When the clip ended, he realized he was smiling. She was already stronger than Craig had ever been, but as the coverage grew more frenzied, so did Craig's desperation. That evening, Graham received an anonymous envelope at his penthouse. Inside was a single flash drive and a typed note. "Thought you might like to see what your new partner was up to. A friend." He waited in his hand for a long moment before plugging it into his laptop. A folder opened, revealing a series of emails between Elena and Craig from nearly 2 years ago. In them, Craig detailed strategies to obscure certain financial losses by reclassifying them as brand development expenses. Elena's replies were terse, but included enough acknowledgement to suggest she'd known more than she'd admitted. Graham closed his eyes. It wasn't damning evidence on its own. She hadn't approved anything illegal, and most of the language was ambiguous. But to the wrong audience, it would look like complicity. His phone buzzed. "Natalie." "You got it too?" she asked without preamble. "2," he repeated. "Half the board has copies," she said. "And the Tribune called to say they're planning a story. Craig's trying to bury her." Graham rubbed a hand over his jaw. "If this goes public, she's finished." "So stop it," Natalie said. "You think I haven't tried?" "Try harder," she snapped. Then her voice softened. "If you care about her half as much as you pretend, don't let him win." He ended the call without replying. For a long time, he sat in the dark, staring at the city below. Then he picked up the phone and called the one person he knew could help. When Elena arrived an hour later, she looked pale but composed. She didn't ask why he'd summoned her after midnight. She just sat down across from him and folded her hands. "Craig's leaking emails," he said. "I know." "I can bury the story," he said carefully. "Or at least delay it, but it won't stay hidden forever." "Then don't," she said, surprising him. "Elena." "No," she said, her voice steady. "I won't spend the rest of my career waiting for this to come out. If I made mistakes, I'll own them." He studied her face, searching for any trace of fear. There was none. Only the quiet resolve he remembered from the early days when she'd been the only person who believed in him. "You realize what you're risking?" he asked finally. "Yes." "And you're still willing?" "Yes." He exhaled, something in his chest easing. "Then we'll do it your way." The next morning, she held a press conference. Graham stood at the back of the room as she stepped up to the podium, a folder in her hands. Cameras flashed, reporters shouting her name, but she didn't flinch. "Over the past several years," she began, her voice carrying clear and strong, "Marlowe and Pierce made a number of financial decisions that were at best questionable. I take responsibility for the fact that I did not challenge certain directives more aggressively. I should have asked more questions. I should have demanded more transparency." A ripple of astonishment moved through the crowd. This wasn't the script they'd expected. "But I want to be clear," she continued, her chin lifting. "I was never aware of criminal activity, and I did not personally profit from any mismanagement. My priority now is to help this company rebuild with honesty and accountability." Reporters began shouting questions. She answered every one with calm precision, never once deflecting blame. By the time she stepped down, the room was hushed with something like respect. Later, in the quiet of his office, Graham watched the replay on his phone. He'd thought he couldn't admire her more than he already did. He'd been wrong. That evening, she came to see him again. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were clear. "You didn't have to stand behind me," she said softly. "I did," he said. She hesitated. "I don't know where this leaves us." He nodded. "Neither do I, but maybe," she said, her voice tentative. "It doesn't have to be the end." His breath caught. Slowly, carefully, he reached for her hand. "Tomorrow," he said, echoing her word from before. She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her in weeks. "Tomorrow," she agreed. Elena hadn't expected the world to feel any different after she spoke her piece. But as she walked out of the press conference, past the reporters still shouting her name, a strange hush settled in her chest. She had spent so long bracing for the day her mistakes would surface, the day everything she'd built would collapse. But now that it was here, now that she had faced it on her own terms, she felt lighter than she had in years. She didn't see Graham until she reached the curb. He was standing beside a black sedan, hands in his coat pockets, watching her with that unreadable expression he wore when he was trying not to give too much away. For a second, she thought about walking past him, about disappearing into a cab and going home alone to the silence she knew so well. But she didn't. Instead, she stopped in front of him and tipped her chin up. "I suppose you came to say I told you so," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. He shook his head. "I came to say you were incredible." A rush of warmth flooded her throat. She looked away, afraid he would see too much. "You didn't have to do that alone," he said softly. "Yes, I did," she murmured. "It was my name on those papers." His jaw tightened. "He used you." "I let him," she said, and for once there was no self-pity in it, only a quiet, clear acceptance. "I thought I was protecting the company, that if I didn't make waves, I could keep everything from falling apart. But it doesn't work that way, does it?" "No," he said, "it doesn't." They stood in silence as the wind tugged at the edges of her hair. Finally, she drew a breath. "I have to get back. There's still so much to sort through." "I'll drive you," he said. She hesitated, then nodded. The ride downtown was quiet. She kept her gaze fixed on the passing streets, noting absently how familiar everything felt, even after years of change. At some point, she became aware of Graham's handrest on the seat between them, palm open as if he were offering something he couldn't name. She didn't reach for it. Not yet. When they arrived, he walked her to the elevator. Just before the doors closed, she turned to face him. "Thank you," she said, and this time she let him see the truth in her eyes. "For everything." He didn't smile, but something in his expression softened. "You don't owe me anything," he said. She wished, briefly, that she could believe him. But they both knew better. The next days were a blur. The board moved quickly to formalize Craig's departure. Emergency audits were launched. Employees circulated cautious emails, trying to figure out which rumors were true and which were the invention of board reporters. Through it all, Elena kept her head down. She answered every question, signed every document, and refused to let herself think too hard about the man who had slipped into her life again like a tide she couldn't resist. Late one night, she was still in her office when she heard a quiet knock. She looked up, surprised to find Graham in the doorway, a takeout bag in one hand. "You're still here," he observed. "So are you," she countered. He lifted the bag. "I brought food. You've probably forgotten to eat." She wanted to argue, to pretend she was fine, but her stomach chose that moment to betray her with a low, embarrassed growl. "Fine," she muttered, "but only because I'm starving." He smiled then, an unguarded, crooked thing that made something ache deep in her chest. They ate sitting on the floor by her window, the city sprawling below them in a million points of light. For a while they talked about neutral things, staff restructuring, media strategy, what would happen next quarter. But eventually the conversation slowed. Graham set his half-finished container aside. "Do you remember the first time we did this?" She didn't have to ask what he meant. She did remember, vividly. A tiny office on the 12th floor of a crumbling building, too broke to afford furniture, eating cheap noodles out of styrofoam while they sketched out plans that seemed impossible. "I remember," she said quietly. "You were the only person who thought any of it would work," he said. "You were the only person who made me feel like it could," she admitted. Their eyes locked, and for a long moment neither of them looked away. "I'm not the same man I was back then," he said. "I know," she whispered. "Neither am I." His gaze searched her face. "And is that better or worse?" She let out a shaky breath. "I don't know yet." He didn't press her. He just nodded, as if that was enough. After he left, she stayed by the window, watching his car pull away into the dark. She wanted to believe that this was a new beginning, that everything they'd survived could become the foundation of something stronger. But she had learned the hard way that hope was a dangerous thing. Still, when she finally turned back to her desk, she found she was smiling, just a little. The next morning, she woke to find her name on the front page of every business publication in the city. But for once, it wasn't attached to scandal. The headline was simple: Brooks leads Marlowe and Pierce into new era. She scanned the article, heart-thumping, and found a quote from Graham buried halfway down. "Elena Brooks is one of the most capable leaders I've ever worked with," he'd told the reporter, "and the company's future is secure in her hands." She set the paper aside, swallowing hard. For a moment, she let herself feel the pride she'd earned. At noon, she met Graham in the main conference room. The last of the board members had just signed off on the restructuring package. When everyone else filed out, she stayed behind. He raised an eyebrow. "Everything all right?" "I'm not sure," she said. He waited, silent and patient, in the way he'd learned she needed him to be. "I keep thinking about everything we've done to each other," she said finally. "All the ways we hurt each other because we were too proud to be honest." "Yeah," he said softly. "I don't want to do that anymore," she whispered. His throat worked. "Neither do I." She took a step closer. "I don't know what this is, or what it could be, but I'd like to try." He didn't touch her. He didn't even smile. He just looked at her with so much quiet reverence it made her heart twist. "Me too," he said simply. Outside, the city hummed with its usual chaos. But in that moment, it felt like the only two people in the world were standing in that glass-walled room, daring to believe in something new. Later that night, he walked her to her car. She turned to face him before she climbed in. "Tomorrow," she said again, just like that first night. He reached out and brushed a stray hair from her cheek, his touch so gentle it made her eyes sting. "Tomorrow," he promised. And for the first time in a very long time, she believed him. The days that followed were a study in delicate balance. Elena woke each morning with the same stubborn ache behind her ribs, a strange combination of exhaustion, anticipation, and the brittle edge of fear that she might be making a mistake she wouldn't be able to undo. Yet every time she walked into her office and found Graham already there, coffee in one hand, a stack of proposals in the other, she felt something she hadn't let herself feel in years. Hope. They had agreed not to put labels on what was happening between them. Too much had been said and done for that, but it was impossible to pretend nothing had changed. The way he looked at her now, without the old arrogance, without the wounded pride, felt like something sacred. And though she tried not to let it show, she couldn't deny that she was drawn to him in a way that terrified her. Still, there was too much work to do to indulge in sentiment. The company had been held together with duct tape and optimism for far too long. Now that Craig Donovan was gone, the full scope of the damage had come into focus. Entire divisions needed to be rebuilt. Clients had to be reassured. Employees who had spent years feeling disposable deserved something better. On Monday morning, she sat at the head of the long conference table, watching her senior team file in one by one. Some looked wary, others looked relieved. All of them looked tired. She knew that feeling intimately. Graham stood at her right, his posture loose but attentive. He didn't speak unless someone asked him a direct question, and he never interrupted her. It was a small thing, but she noticed. She appreciated it more than she could say. "Thank you all for coming," Elena began, her voice carrying across the hushed room. "I know this has been a difficult few weeks, but today is about moving forward." She outlined the new strategy: streamlined processes, transparent budgeting, open communication. It was everything she'd dreamed of building, back when she'd been a junior analyst with more ambition than power. As she spoke, she saw heads nodding, saw something loosening in people's shoulders. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then, one by one, her team began to applaud. She felt her throat tighten. She didn't look at Graham, but she felt the heat of his gaze all the same. After the meeting, he caught up with her in the hallway. "That was impressive," he said softly. "Don't start," she murmured, but there was no heat in her voice. "I'm serious. You did what most people couldn't." She turned to face him, her back against the wall. "It doesn't fix everything." "No," he agreed, "but it's a start." For a second, she almost reached for him. Almost. But then one of the assistants rounded the corner, and she stepped away. That night, she found herself in her apartment staring out the window at the city lights. Her phone sat on the counter behind her, silent and accusing. She wanted to call him, to hear his voice, to admit that she was scared and that none of her careful plans felt like enough. But she didn't. She couldn't. Instead, she turned off the light and went to bed alone. It might have stayed that way, safe, distant, if not for the email she received 2 days later. It arrived just after 6 in the morning, while she was still sitting cross-legged on her couch with a cup of tea balanced on her knee. The subject line was blank. The body of the message contained only a link. She stared at it for a long moment, her pulse skittering. Then she clicked. A video began to play, grainy security footage from the executive suite. She recognized herself immediately, standing beside Craig Donovan. Her arms were folded across her chest, her expression tense. Craig was speaking, gesturing toward a sheaf of papers on the desk. She remembered that day, remembered the sick feeling in her gut as he outlined yet another dubious workaround to cover a funding gap. The footage had no sound. Anyone watching would have no way to know what she'd said in reply. And that was exactly why it was dangerous. At the bottom of the screen, a watermark glowed. Property of Donovan and Associates. Her phone rang, slicing through the sudden hush. She didn't need to check the caller ID to know who it was. "Hello, Elena," Craig's voice drawled. Even through the line, she could hear the satisfaction. "What do you want?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice level. "Relax," he said. "I'm not your enemy." "You're not my..." She bit the words back, pressing her free hand to her forehead. "What is this?" "A reminder," he said, "that you and I both know the truth about what happened in those meetings." "I never agreed to your schemes," she hissed. He sighed. "Intentions don't matter, Elena. Perception does. And right now, the perception is that you were my willing accomplice." She closed her eyes. "Get to the point." "I want a settlement," he said. "A generous one. Enough that I can start over somewhere else." She let out a sharp laugh. "You want me to pay you to leave me alone?" "If you don't," he said mildly, "I'll release the footage to the press. You know what they'll say." Her hands were trembling. "You're blackmailing me." "Call it whatever you like," Craig said, "but you have until Friday to decide." Then the line went dead. She sat there for a long time, her tea cooling on the table, her heart a hollow drumbeat in her chest. She didn't call Graham right away. Some stubborn part of her still wanted to believe she could fix this alone. But as the hours crawled by, the weight of it became too much. By dusk, she found herself standing outside his building, clutching her phone like a lifeline. He answered on the first ring. "Elena?" "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Come up." When he opened the door, she didn't bother with pleasantries. She walked past him into the living room, set her bag on the table, and turned to face him. "He's threatening me," she said. Graham's expression didn't change, but she saw the way his jaw tightened. "Craig?" She nodded. "He has video. From the security feeds. It makes it look like I was helping him." "Show me," he said. She pulled up the email and handed him her phone. As he watched, she folded her arms over her chest to keep from shaking. When the clip ended, he looked up at her. "He sent this to you?" "And probably to half the board," she said. "He wants money." "Of course he does." Graham set the phone down. "You're not giving him a cent." "I don't see another option," she said, her voice breaking. "If he releases this, then we fight it," he said. "Together." Her breath caught. "Graham." "No." He crossed to her, taking her shoulders in his hands. "Listen to me. He is counting on you to panic, to fold, but you have nothing to be ashamed of." "You don't know that," she whispered. "You weren't there." "Then tell me," he said softly. "Tell me exactly what happened." So she did. She told him everything, every meeting, every half-truth, every moment when she'd wanted to walk away but hadn't. By the time she finished, her throat felt raw. When she dared to look up, he was watching her with something like wonder. "You know what I see?" he asked. She shook her head. "I see someone who tried to protect her people," he said. "Someone who was backed into a corner and did the best she could." Tears welled in her eyes. "What if that's not enough?" "It is," he said fiercely. "It's more than enough." She didn't resist when he pulled her into his arms. For a long time, she just stood there, her cheek pressed to his chest, letting herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this anymore. When she finally pulled back, she felt steadier. "What do we do?" she asked. "We make a statement," he said. "We get ahead of the story. And if Craig wants a fight, he can have one." A flicker of fear crossed her face. "This could ruin me." He cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. "Or it could set you free." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. When she looked at him again, her voice was steady. "Then let's do it." He nodded, and for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. The morning Elena decided to face the fallout head-on dawned cold and colorless, a thin drizzle turning the sidewalks to mirrors. She woke before her alarm, her heart hammering against her ribs as though it had sensed her resolve before her mind had fully accepted it. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped between her knees, and let herself feel everything she'd tried to bury in the days since Craig's ultimatum. The fear, the humiliation, the bone-deep fatigue. But beneath all of it, there was a steely clarity she hadn't felt in years. She was tired of running, tired of letting other people decide how her story would be told. When her phone rang, she didn't flinch. She expected it to be Graham. Instead, it was Natalie. "He sent the video to the Tribune," Natalie said without preamble. "They're going to run a story by noon." Elena closed her eyes. For a moment, her courage faltered. Then she drew a slow breath and stood. "Call the Tribune's editor," she said, her voice steady. "Tell them I'll give an exclusive interview in 1 hour." "You're sure?" "Yes." She looked out the window at the rain-slicked city. "If this is going to happen, it's going to happen on my terms." She hung up and turned to her closet, her hands unsteady but her purpose clear. She chose a simple navy dress and a soft gray jacket, clothes she felt herself in, unadorned by any armor she might have once believed she needed. Half an hour later, she stepped into the lobby of Marlowe and Pierce. The receptionist startled at the sight of her, as if she'd expected Elena to slink away and disappear. But Elena lifted her chin and kept walking. She found Graham waiting by the elevators. He looked like he hadn't slept, but when he saw her, something eased in his shoulders. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. "I know," she replied, and for the first time she meant it. They rode up to the 24th floor in silence. As the doors opened, the Tribune's lead business reporter stood waiting with a cameraman. Elena could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation of a spectacle. But as she stepped forward, she refused to let it touch her. She shook the reporter's hand, introduced herself to the cameraman, and gestured toward the small conference room overlooking the city's skyline. "I'll answer your questions," she said calmly, "but I'd like to make a statement first." The reporter nodded, her expression curious but not unkind. When the camera's red light blinked on, Elena folded her hands on the table and looked straight into the lens. "I'm not going to deny the footage you've received," she began, her voice even. "It's real. It shows me in meetings with Craig Donovan, discussing financial strategies that I believed at the time were necessary to keep this company afloat. I see now that they were part of a larger pattern of unethical behavior I didn't fully understand." She drew a breath, feeling Graham's quiet presence just behind her. "I won't pretend I'm blameless. I should have asked harder questions. I should have walked away sooner. But I didn't. I let my loyalty and fear convince me that compromise was the only way to survive." Her gaze didn't waver. "Today, I'm choosing something different. I'm choosing to tell the truth, no matter how it makes me look, because this company and the people who rely on it deserve better." The room was silent except for the soft hum of the camera. The reporter cleared her throat. "Do you expect to keep your position?" Elena considered the question. "That isn't up to me. If the board decides my mistakes outweigh my contributions, I'll accept that. But I won't pretend anymore." Another question followed, and then another. She answered all of them with the same unflinching honesty. By the time the interview ended, her voice felt raw. But as the reporter thanked her and the cameraman began packing up, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Free. When the journalists left, she sagged back in her chair, exhaustion washing over her in a heavy wave. She half expected Graham to say something, some careful reassurance or businesslike suggestion, but he didn't. He just walked around the table, knelt in front of her, and took her hands in his. "You are extraordinary," he said softly. Her throat tightened. "It doesn't feel like it." He smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "That's how you know it was real." She laughed, a shaky sound that felt dangerously close to a sob. Without thinking, she leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. "I don't know what happens now," she whispered. "Neither do I," he murmured. "But whatever it is, I'm here." She believed him. That afternoon, the Tribune posted the story. It spread faster than she'd expected, shared across social media, picked up by other outlets, dissected in comment threads and on evening news panels. But to her surprise, the response wasn't the tidal wave of condemnation she'd feared. Some headlines were predictably brutal, but others called her statement a masterclass in accountability, praising her refusal to deflect blame. Clients who had been on the verge of pulling their contracts emailed to express their support. Employees left notes on her desk thanking her for telling the truth. By the end of the week, the board voted to keep her in place. The official statement cited her integrity and transparency as proof she was the right person to lead the company's recovery. When she read the email, she sat very still, letting the relief settle in her bones. Then she stood and walked to Graham's office. He looked up as she stepped inside. "Well, they're keeping me," she said. His smile was slow, warm, and just a little incredulous. "You did it." "We did it," she corrected. Before she could second-guess herself, she crossed the room and kissed him. It wasn't the desperate, furious kiss they'd shared once in a forgotten hallway years ago. It was something quieter, steadier, a promise she wasn't ready to name but wasn't afraid of anymore. When she pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. "I missed you," he murmured. "I missed you too," she admitted. They stood there for a long moment, the city sprawling around them until a soft chime from her phone broke the silence. She glanced down, then sighed. "I have to get back. There's still a mountain of work." He smiled. "I'll walk you." Outside her office, she paused. "Graham?" "Yeah?" Her voice was quiet. "You asked me once if I thought we were better or worse than we used to be." He nodded. "I think we're better," she said, "because now we know what it costs to lose each other." He didn't say anything, but his hand found hers. In the weeks that followed, they settled into something that looked almost like peace. They still argued, over budgets, over press releases, over the 1,000 decisions that came with rebuilding a company from the inside out. But the fights no longer felt like battles to be won or lost. They were simply part of the work. Messy, necessary, honest. Sometimes, when the office was quiet and the last of the staff had gone home, she would catch him watching her with an expression so unguarded it made her heart stutter. And sometimes, when the old doubts crept in, she would remember that look and the way he had knelt in front of her when she'd been too tired to pretend she wasn't afraid. And she would believe that maybe, after everything, they had found something worth keeping. One evening, months after Craig's threats had faded into irrelevance, she and Graham stood on the roof of the building, the wind cool against their skin. "Tell me the truth," she said quietly. "If it all falls apart again, if I fall apart again, will you still be here?" He didn't hesitate. "Every time," he said. She turned to look at him, searching for any flicker of doubt. She found none, and for the first time in years, she realized she no longer needed to be certain of everything. It was enough to know they were trying, enough to know they'd learned how to stand beside each other without the armor. He reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Tomorrow," she said, smiling. "Tomorrow," he echoed, and this time it wasn't a promise or a question. It was the truth. Every story leaves us with lessons that reach beyond the characters and their struggles. Graham and Elena's journey is no different. At its heart, this is a story about accountability, courage, and the quiet resilience it takes to rebuild what's been broken. One of the most powerful lessons here is that no success, whether personal or professional, can truly last if it's built on silence and compromise. Elena spent years believing that staying quiet was the cost of survival, that sacrificing her instincts was the price of loyalty. But when everything fell apart, it wasn't her perfection that saved her. It was her willingness to stand up, tell the truth, and face the consequences. Graham's journey reminds us that love isn't just about passion or ambition. Sometimes it's about showing up when it's least convenient, offering your strength without expecting anything in return, and respecting the person you care about enough to let them fight their own battles. Together, they learn that trust isn't given all at once. It's rebuilt choice by choice, moment by moment, through honesty and consistency. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Real growth doesn't happen in comfort. It happens when you decide to stop hiding from your mistakes, your feelings, and your own potential. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is look someone you care about in the eye and say, I'm here, no matter what. I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what part of Graham and Elena's journey resonated most with you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story. Thank you for being here.